On a pitch-black night over the Indian Ocean, a Boeing 747 Combi is being eaten from the inside by an 1,100 degrees Celsius inferno. As 140 passengers crush toward the nose to escape the toxic fumes, the pilots make a desperate, unthinkable choice. They heave open the cabin doors at 14,000 feet. But the real mystery isn't just the fire, it's the missing evidence. Where are you watching from? Comment below. This is the chilling story of the flight that snapped in half and the government's secret that might have doomed it. The tragedy of Flight 295 began on November 27, 1987, in Taipei. The aircraft, a Boeing 747-200 Combi, was a unique beast of the skies. Unlike standard jets, the rear third of the main deck wasn't filled with seats, it was packed with high-density cargo pallets, separated from the passengers by only a thin partition. It was a design meant for efficiency, but on this night, it was a recipe for catastrophe. In the cockpit was Captain Dai Us, a former Air Force pilot with 14,000 hours. He was a veteran who had expressed private fears for years about the cargo his airline was forced to carry. You see, in 1987, South Africa was an international pariah under apartheid. Hit by a global arms embargo, the government had turned to its national airline to smuggle the weapons of war. As the Helderberg lifted off into the darkness, it wasn't just carrying electronics and passengers. It was likely carrying the forbidden fuel for a violent war in Angola. The manifest listed computer components, but investigators would later suspect something much more volatile: red phosphorus or ammonium perchlorate, chemicals that provide their own oxygen when they burn. 90 minutes into the flight, while crossing the South China Sea, the first anomaly appeared. The cockpit voice recorder, CVR, captured the crew discussing dinner. Suddenly, a chime. Circuit breakers began to pop. One, then 10, then dozens. The fire wasn't just smoking, it was melting the aircraft's nervous system. Then, the CVR went dead. Here is the first puzzle piece. Why did the recorder stop hours before the crash? If the fire started near Taiwan, how did the plane make it all the way to Mauritius? This gap in time suggests a terrifying scenario: a fire that was extinguished or suppressed, only to reignite hours later with a fury that no extinguisher could tame. The pilots were flying a ghost ship across the southern Indian Ocean, unaware that the embers behind them were waiting for the air to hit them. But that decision would have been enough to destroy most people. What happened next made everything before it look minor. As the plane neared the island of Mauritius, the nightmare returned in full force. Captain Us radioed the tower, his voice steady but urgent. "We request a full emergency," he said. The fire had breached the ceiling of the cargo hold, melting the control cables and filling the cabin with a thick, acrid soup of carbon monoxide. If you're finding this breakdown of aviation conspiracies and technical failures vital, hit the subscribe button now. We expose the invisible forces that shape history every week. In Johannesburg, the airline's private radio station, ZUR, was listening. ZUR was the airline's umbilical cord to its fleet. On any other night, every word between the pilots and the airline would be recorded on tape. But when investigators went to retrieve the ZUR tape for that night, it had vanished. The tapes from the night before and the night after were there, sitting in their slots. Only the tape from the night of the crash was gone. This missing piece is the strongest evidence of a cover-up. It suggests that the airline and the government knew exactly what was in that cargo hold. They may have even given the pilots instructions to keep flying despite the initial fire to avoid an inspection in a foreign country like Thailand or Malaysia. Inside the plane, the situation was now unrecoverable. The passengers were dying in their seats from smoke inhalation before the flames even reached them. In a last-ditch effort to clear the smoke, the crew followed a checklist that called for opening the doors mid-flight. Imagine the chaos. The roar of 400 kilometers per hour winds mixing with the screams of the dying and the roar of a 1,000-degree fire. The oxygen rushing in didn't clear the smoke. It acted like a bellows, turning the cargo hold into a blast furnace. The heat grew so intense that it began to melt the 747's primary structure. The tail was no longer supported by the air. It was being held on by liquid aluminum. She thought she had won. She had no idea what Thomas was already putting in motion. The climax of Flight 295 was a structural collapse. At 4:07 a.m., 134 miles from Mauritius, the Helderberg reached its breaking point. The fire had weakened the fuselage to the point that the aerodynamic forces simply tore the plane apart. It didn't crash into the ocean. It snapped in half at 14,000 feet. The wreckage rained down into the deepest part of the Indian Ocean, 14,000 feet below the surface. It would take 2 years and millions of dollars to dredge up the pieces. When the fire experts finally looked at the charred remains, they were stunned. The fire had burned so hot that it had melted glass and steel. This wasn't a cigarette or a lithium battery. This was a chemical fire, one that required a dedicated oxygen source. The official investigation was inconclusive, blaming unidentified combustible materials. But the shredded cargo manifests and the rewritten documents found in Taipei told a different story. The airline had systematically deleted the evidence of what was loaded onto the front right pallet. The tragedy of the Helderberg led to a global ban on the Combi configuration for 747s. The FAA and other authorities realized that a fire on the main deck, separated by only a curtain or a thin wall, was a death sentence for everyone on board. It proved that in the battle between fire and aluminum, the airframe will always lose. For the families of the 159 victims, the expert trap was the government's insistence that the airline was safe. The pilots were heroes who fought a losing battle, but they were placed in that cockpit by a system that prioritized war over life. The ocean remains a silent grave for 46 of those passengers, and the truth remains locked in the vaults of a government that no longer exists. Passengers often assume the greatest dangers are engine failures or storms, but hidden cargo can be just as deadly. If crews do not fully know what is on board, they cannot properly prepare for emergencies. In the case of Flight 295, Captain Dai Us and his crew were likely placed into a situation no amount of training could overcome. A fire fueled by hazardous chemicals inside a sealed cargo area can rapidly generate toxic smoke, extreme heat, and structural collapse. Once the aircraft itself begins to melt from within, even the most experienced pilots lose the ability to save it. This became another example of the expert trap. Captain Us was respected as both a patriot and a professional aviator. But expertise becomes meaningless when critical information is hidden from the people responsible for safety. The crew may never have known the true nature of the danger growing behind them. The legacy of Flight 295 permanently changed aviation cargo procedures. Today, hazardous materials are heavily regulated, cargo manifests are scrutinized far more aggressively, and the old Combi aircraft concept has largely disappeared from passenger aviation. The industry learned a painful lesson. Civilian travel and high-risk cargo cannot safely coexist under secrecy. Even now, the unanswered questions surrounding South African 295 continue to echo through aviation history. Sometimes what is missing from the record says more than what remains. Top of form, bottom of form. There is a final, chilling testimony from a ZUR operator